They said it couldn't be climbed. They said that dragons flew in the skies above it, and demons danced on its summit. But then, on the 14th of July, 1865, the impossible became reality. 7 men reached the top of the Matterhorn. For one of them, Edward Whymper, it was the end of an obsession which had lasted 5 long years, and an event that he would regret for the rest of his life. Today, the Matterhorn is one of the most famous mountains in the world. Its image has graced everything from muesli boxes to designer jewelry. In Zermatt, the small Swiss town at the foot of the mountain, it dominates the skyline and everything else.
When you see the Matterhorn for the first time, you can't help but be amazed by it's just so majestic and absolutely you're sort of the picture of a mountain that you always did as a child.
All the mountains around there are super, but the Matterhorn is the one with star quality. Your eyes are always drawn back to it. It's always special, and it has so many different moods.
A mountain calls you to come and climb. You measure your strength and your will and your courage with a dangerous mountain. It is really an exclamation, come, and you feel it in your soul, you have to go.
Every year, more than 1 million tourists pass through Zermatt. But once, this was just a small village, populated by a handful of peasants and their livestock. Occasionally, a traveler would stop by to stare at the Matterhorn, but no one tried to climb it. It was 14,700 feet high and shrouded in superstition. Half the mountain lay in Switzerland, and the other half across the border in Italy. On both sides, it looked impossibly steep. Then, in the 1850s, things began to change. Railways came to the Alps, and foreign tourists flocked in. Some of them started to climb the mountains for the pleasure of it, and soon a new sport was born: mountaineering. The keenest of the first mountaineers were the British. In 1858, a group of them formed the world's first club devoted to mountaineering, the Alpine Club.
Britain was a real power, and we could do anything. The Victorians had tremendous self-confidence, and if there is a mountain there to climb, well, we'll climb it. We're British. We'll go and do it.
Most of them were professional men. There was a lot of lawyers, a lot of academics, university lecturers, quite a lot of clerics. It was just this small sect of people, of basically English gentlemen, that suddenly thought this is rather a good thing to do. And it was a craze.
Britain was obsessed by sport, which was described as physical exercise combined with hazard. And the ultimate sport was fox hunting, and a bit lower down on the scale came tiger shooting and buffalo hunting. And a lot of people naturally couldn't afford to do any of these things, and mountaineering was a cheap way to gratify the national longing.
In the years that followed, the men of the Alpine Club yomped through Europe, climbing everything in sight. The Schreckhorn, the Weisshorn, the Taschhorn, the Fischerhorn, the Dent Blanche, the Dent d'Héron, Castor, the Liscam, the Gabelhorn, the Rothorn. One by one they fell. All except one peak. Then, in the summer of 1860, the 20-year-old Edward Whymper arrived in Switzerland. The Matterhorn had met its match.
A very determined and, I wouldn't say he had, I think, a rather humourless face, but he did have a sense of humour, I'm sure. But it is, I think, a very determined face, yes. I think he must have had terrific willpower.
Whymper was different from the men of the Alpine Club. They were nicknamed Cambridge University at Play. He'd left school at 14 to work in his father's business.
Whymper did not come from the upper classes. He wasn't an aristocrat. He's from one of the lower levels of society. So, in a sense, he was perhaps treated in those days as a commoner.
Climb as well as he might, there was no disguising the fact that he dropped his H's, which other people in the Alpine Club didn't do.
By trade, Whymper was an engraver. He was only able to visit Switzerland when a publisher commissioned him to sketch some alpine scenes. He was fascinated by what he saw, but he soon became more interested in learning how to climb mountains than how to draw them. When Whymper first saw the Matterhorn, he wasn't that impressed. But when he heard everyone else talking about it as the last great prize in the Alps, he determined that he would be the first person to climb it.
He always thought he was going to be famous. You know, he always thought he was going to amount to something more than, you know, just being an engraver or working at what his father did. He felt destined to do something extraordinary.
First of all, he had to learn the ropes of mountaineering, Victorian style.
When Whymper first came to the Alps in 1860, he'd never climbed. He knew nothing about climbing. I think he'd had one little foray, very dangerous foray onto Beachy Head. And I think they were learning as they went.
Today, mountaineering equipment is very specialized. But in Whymper's era, climbers had to make do with tweed suits and goose pimples.
Climbing. Tweed is very good stuff. It's very warm, it's comparatively windproof. It's a bit scratchy for some people's taste. The problem is when it gets wet, it gets that horrible damp, prickly feeling, and it takes a long time to dry out.
For footwear, they used the same hobnail boots that farm laborers wore.
Nowadays, it's completely different. We use cleated rubber soles. And they say that rubber works much better on rock and has much better friction. But in fact, it's amazing how well these nails actually grip on the rock. I think I might actually take up climbing in hobnail boots. The ice axe, I was less impressed with. They used to carry these things, and even longer ones, wherever they went. And it seems to me incredibly unwieldy. I think a short, modern, lightweight alloy axe is a lot preferable. Right, let's get rid of this thing. I think, if anything, they were better climbers than we are. They move very fast, very competently on exposed, dangerous ground. They were using these ropes, which would probably snap if they were put severely to the test. And they were tied, the rope was just tied round the waist, so that even if they did fall and were saved, they were going to have a terrible wrench on the waist. Yeah, the world-class mountaineer doing his stuff.
Whymper discovered that he had a natural gift for climbing, but he knew that he wouldn't be able to conquer the Matterhorn by himself. In those days, virtually no one climbed without a local guide. They were as essential as ropes and ice axes. So, in 1861, he journeyed over to the Italian side of the Matterhorn, where he hoped to hire Jean-Antoine Carrel, the cock of Val Tournage.
Well, here in the valley is known as a great climber. He was also he was called also il Bersagliere because he served the war for the unification of Italy, and he was also a hunter, and probably the passion for the climbing came from there. No? All the hunters here in the valley are always good climber.
Even today, he's still a local legend, the only alpine guide who's been the subject of a feature film. Carrel was the only guide who really believed that the Matterhorn could be climbed. And what's more, he actually wanted to do it, with or without a foreign client.
Era un carattere.
He was the kind of man who was difficult to get to know, the silent type. He did a lot, but he didn't say very much. He would come and he would go, but always in silence. He was a very tough man, everyone said that. And once he got the idea into his head, he just had to get to the summit.
My name is Wimper. You are Mr. Wimper. The Wimper who climbed Mont Blanc last week with Cross? Yes, and now I want you as guide. I come here to find you. If you're willing to start right away. Certainly. But I tell you, this mountain is not Mont Blanc.
Wimper was full of admiration for Carrel. He said that Jean-Antoine was the best rock climber he'd ever met. But he was infuriated by the Italians' refusal to take orders.
Hold there! Can't you see it? It's no use. We must. Another yard and we're out.
Carrel was constantly prevaricating, sitting on the fence. He would tease Wimper along. He'd take him so far up the mountain, and Wimper actually said he seemed to be spinning out the ascent for his own purposes.
He was a highly ambitious and very, very confident person. He was also a nationalist. This was the time when Italy, the nation-state of Italy, had first started, and Carrel was very keen to get the first ascent of the Matterhorn for the prestige of Italy.
Wimper made 7 attempts on the Matterhorn from the Italian side, 3 of them with Carrel, but he never got within 1,000 feet of the top. He commissioned his own tent, his own ice axe, a grappling hook, and numerous climbers' aids. One year he turned up in France with a special folding ladder for scaling rocks. The customs officers were convinced that he was a burglar and only let him through when he pretended to be part of a circus act. Elsewhere in the Alps, he climbed several famous peaks and gained a reputation as a mountaineer who was both daring and meticulous. But the only mountain he really cared about was the Matterhorn.
He did become obsessed with it. Because of its reputation for inaccessibility, the person who conquered the Matterhorn would be remembered forever. And I think Wimper was very conscious of that. And that was what motivated him to push the envelope, to try to go beyond the levels of risk that were considered acceptable.
Wimper knew that Carrel wasn't the only person interested in climbing the Matterhorn. The Irish scientist John Tyndall almost reached the top in 1862, and there were several other members of the Alpine Club who also had their eyes on the prize.
They're ambitious men. These mountains by this time had assumed great prestige amongst them. and no more so than the Matterhorn itself. It was as if, you know, events were moving towards this great moment.
In June 1865, Whymper returned to Switzerland with an audacious plan to knock off the Matterhorn and all the remaining unclimbed peaks of any note. In one amazing month, he and his guides stormed through the Alps, climbing the Dent Blanche, the Grand Cornier, the Grand Jurasse, the Aiguille Verte, the Col de Lan, the Col de Talefre and the Ruinette. In 4 weeks, they climbed 100,000 feet and walked some 400 miles. In early July, he dismissed his first set of guides and headed for Italy in search of his old sparring partner, Jean-Antoine Carrel, for what he was sure would be his final attempt on the Matterhorn. At first, Carrel agreed to accompany him, but he was even more evasive than usual, and he didn't mention one key fact. He'd already committed himself to a new and much more important client. A member of the Italian government had invited Carrel to lead an all-Italian attempt on the Matterhorn. Sella was a keen climber and had recently founded the Italian Alpine Club, modelled on the British. He was parodied in the press for his love of the mountains, but his enthusiasm was undimmed.
Climbing mountains was good for young people. It was a good school for them, for the effort they had to make later in life. He declares in many political speeches how fine it could be if you could oblige every young man of Italy to climb a mountain for the country as a whole.
Sella maintained that if the Matterhorn were to be climbed from the Italian side, it would bring thousands of tourists into the run-down Italian valleys and turn Jean-Antoine Carrel into a national hero. Carrel was persuaded.
Carrel probably knew that if he made it to the top with Whymper, Whymper would be the one who walked away with all the glory. It would have been considered a British ascent of the Matterhorn. He would have become sort of invisible, would have been pushed to the sidelines for Whymper to have taken all the glory. So, was Carrel justified? Maybe.
4 days after he'd arrived in Italy, Whymper woke up to hear that Carrel had set off for the mountain without him.
They'd absolutely tricked him completely. Carrel had hired all the porters and all the guides in the valley, and then he crept out one morning and stole the march. And when Whymper got up, he found Carrel was halfway up the mountain and he didn't have any guides or porters to chase after him. So he was furious.
Then, suddenly, striding over the Théodule Pass from Switzerland, came Lord Francis Douglas, the middle son of the mad, bad Queensberry clan.
They were an aristocratic, moneyed family, and Francis had the opportunity of following his great love, which was mountaineering. He was very fit, very courageous, and evidently very able in the mountains.
It was his 3rd season in the Alps. A week earlier, he'd made a hair-raising ascent of the nearby Obergabelhorn, and now he offered to join Whymper for an attack on the Matterhorn from the Swiss side.
Whymper immediately saw this as a chance to beat Carrel. So he immediately said to Douglas, okay, well, let's do it, let's go. Or rather, as Whymper put it, he let Douglas take part in his plan.
Whymper and Douglas headed back across the border to Zermatt and got ready to climb the following day. Then something very strange happened. At the Monte Rosa Hotel, Whymper met another English climber who declared that he too was just about to climb the Matterhorn. It was the Reverend Charles Hudson.
Hudson was a very accomplished climber and very well respected among the British climbing community. He had put on hold plans to go elsewhere to explore in the Nile that summer so that he could go to the Matterhorn.
Rather than have yet more competition, Whymper suggested they should join forces. Hudson agreed, on one condition. They would also have to take his traveling companion. Douglas Haddo was a 19-year-old straight out of Harrow. He'd just climbed Mont Blanc and was raring to go.
For all the lack of experience that Haddo had, Haddo was fantastically fit, and from his experiences on the Mont Blanc would seem to be, you know, exceptionally dedicated as well. He was someone who, you point him in that right direction and said, go, he went.
Whymper wasn't keen on taking a novice up the Matterhorn, but Hudson was adamant, and in the end he agreed.
A lot of climbers would turn around and say, well, I don't think I'm going to do this. I'm going to stay in the valley. I'm going to wait until the situation is better for me to make a safer climb. But Whymper doesn't do that. He says, I want to be on the first descent of this mountain.
I think he was just frantic to get to the top, and he seriously feared that Carroll was going to beat him, and he absolutely had to get there first.
On the following morning, they set off, accompanied by 3 Alpine guides. Old Peter Taugwalder and his son young Peter from Zermatt, and Michel Croz, the famous climber from Chamonix. And so Edward Whymper, a man who had always planned everything meticulously, was now heading for the Matterhorn with 3 British climbers that he'd only just met, aiming to climb by a route he'd never tried before, 2 days after his rival Carrel had set out for the mountain. The race was on for the summit of the Matterhorn. It took them a day to reach the northeast ridge, a sharp divide which the guides thought might take them to the summit.
It's very, very long, that ridge. It's very complicated, and virtually at every stage of that long, long journey, there is potential to fall off and kill yourself. There's huge scope for error. You're very, very exposed. You've got this incredible sensation of space dropping away beneath you. It's 4,000 feet vertical ascent from the hut. So it's just a hell of a long way. You're winding in and out of pinnacles and crossing gullies. It's very, very complicated. And you're basically on the edge of this huge, great expanse of the east face. And so initially, it's very hard to grasp where on earth you are going. But gradually, as you get higher, the thing begins to make sense. And then you see the great shoulder, this great overhanging prow above you. And suddenly the whole thing becomes more and more dramatic.
To Whymper's amazement, they made rapid progress. From a distance, the Matterhorn looked much steeper on the Swiss side than the Italian, but in fact, it was a far easier climb. But he couldn't stop thinking about Carrel. At any moment, Whymper expected to see him waving an Italian flag on the summit.
They both had the will to go all the way, but who would get there first and who second, I can't say. They both really wanted it. That combination of one from one side and one from the other, maybe they could have both got to the top.
Carrel had had a huge head start, but bad weather and tough climbing had slowed him down. Whymper had struck lucky. On his 9th attempt, he'd finally found the best route to the top. After 6 hours, Whymper's party were in sight of their goal. But now the climbing got much tougher.
It was just about here on the way up when suddenly things started to get serious. And the main guide, Michel Croz, actually said, now we're in for some real business, or words to that effect. And they looked up and they saw that the rocks become incredibly steep. And so they traversed out to the right, actually right onto the north face. and it's very awkward terrain and very, very exposed.
Young Haddo started to find the going very difficult, but the others had no problems.
Nowadays, it's very different because the modern route goes straight up these steep rocks with these dirty great cables that you just pull up on hand over hand, and it's all become a lot easier than it was in Whymper's day.
At 1:40, Whymper and the guide Michel Croz detached themselves from the others and raced to the summit.
It must have been fantastic for them, the first lot up there. You know, must have been the most incredible moment of joy, I think, for them.
The sheer amount of his personality that he invested in that mountain, the number of attempts and efforts, it was the fulfillment of the main theme of his life.
They walked along the ridge, looking for any sign of Carrel, but they saw nothing. Then, suddenly, Whymper spotted the Italians 1,000 feet below.
He calls to Croz, and they begin to prise off the rocks. They take their ice axe and put them in and send boulders tumbling down the slope towards the Italians. Not just, hey, look, we're here, but almost as enough to harm them, based on his account. He doesn't say that that's what he was doing, but he wanted them to know that he was there, that he had won, and that they should turn back.
Carrel, he saw them and he heard their voices, and at that point was the end. The end of the race, anyway, for him.
Look, there's the Italian party.
Where?
Carrel turned back. Whymper and the others stayed on the summit for an hour. 2 days ago, most of them had never even met. Now they'd conquered the Matterhorn. Next, though, they had to get down.
There is that little bit of an anticlimax, the job's done. But with difficult mountains, that anticlimax is always charged with the reality of the fact that it's all very well getting up a mountain, but the job isn't successfully done until you've got down safely.
At 2:40, they left the summit. The strongest guide, Michel Croz, was in the lead, followed by Haddo, the weakest climber. Whymper stayed back to plant a bottle with a list of their names on the summit. Before they reached the difficult section on the north face, Whymper caught up with the others and tied on between the two Taugwalders.
They had to reverse their steps back down these very awkward rocks out on the right on the north face. And as they were coming down that section, they stopped and they re-roped. And at that stage, young Haddo, the most inexperienced climber, was in front with Michel Croz. And there was a particular passage somewhere up there where Haddo slipped and knocked against Michel Croz, knocked Michel Croz flying. He pulled off Hudson, he pulled off Douglas. There was an almighty great tug on the rope, and that tug came on old Peter Taugwalder, and he was given this enormous great jolt, and the rope just snapped in midair. The two Taugwalders and Whymper just watched in horror as their four companions slid and then started tumbling down the slope, and they were actually tumbling down that slope over there, and they saw them tumbling, and then they just disappeared down over the north face to fall 4,000 feet to the bottom of the face.
idea that someone has fallen from near the summit and tumbled just off that sheer edge is a horrific thought. What happens to a body when it bounces down those thousands and thousands of feet?
They found broken bodies, shattered remains, an arm, a leg, a boot, a skull with a chunk taken out of it, human entrails, just bits of each of the climbers except for Lord Francis Douglas. Douglas, the speculation was that his body lodged in a crevice somewhere up the mountain, and bits of his clothing, one of his boots, reached the bottom of the peak, but his body itself was never found.
Long before she heard the first official news of the tragedy, Lord Francis Douglas's mother had a sleepless night in London.
During the night, the maid came into the room 4 times, thinking that she'd been called. And when she came in, she was saying that she was being called by her surname, which was actually the name that only Francis used for her. And on the 4th time when she came in, she said that she'd had this vision that Francis was lying on a very high ledge and that he was very, very badly wounded. And Francis' mother actually calmed her down and sent her back and asked her not to come back to the room. And of course, actually, that was the night of the accident. As soon as he heard Francis's elder brother went to Zermatt, and he arrived late, and he was trying to get a search party together, and he was offering a huge reward, but everyone in Zermatt was very cautious, and so he left it was already nightfall, and went up to the glacier and tried to look for his brother. And he got just above where the Hornley Hut is now, and having never done any mountaineering and was just screaming for his brother, and they could hear his cries down in Zermatt.
Whymper stayed in Zermatt for 2 weeks. He helped to organize the funerals and gave evidence at a public inquiry. Then he returned to London. The English press wanted simple answers, and they wanted them quickly. And above all, they wanted someone to blame.
You've got all the ingredients of a major scandal. A peer of the realm has died, a well-known cleric, a leading guide, a young man in, at the start of his life. Public want answers. They want solutions.
The first candidate for blame was Whymper himself. Was it his overambition, his obsession, which had led all the others to their deaths?
It wasn't due to an obsession. I mean, that he's obsessed, but who isn't? Most people get killed coming down. They're tired, it's late in the day, they've taken too long, they're coming down in the dark, they're going too fast, da-da-da-da. They make technical mistakes, and we've all done it. Some of us survived. But, that's the most dangerous part.
The tragedy must have put him on the defensive, I think, with accusations flying and so on. And again, although he was a mature 25, still at 25, that must have been very hard to cope with, I think.
Next up was Haddo. The official inquiry in Zermatt determined that his slip was the sole cause of the accident.
Go on, boy, it's all right.
In films of the 1930s, Haddo was portrayed as a simpering dimwit.
Haddo had lost his nerve. Did not know where to put his feet, and that actually Cross had turned around and was helping him to place each foot into the next foothold when Haddo slips.
He climbed the Matterhorn. He's 19. He's only done one mountain before. What more can you ask of somebody? And I think, frankly, it is completely out of order for people to run him down. Anybody could have slipped. It happened to be him. If that hadn't happened, and there's every chance that it wouldn't have happened, it was only that one section of the mountain, a very small section, actually they were halfway down, and then it was pretty much free running back to the base. He would have been a hero, unchallenged.
In private, Whymper said that Haddo shouldn't have been there, but he blamed Charles Hudson for bringing him along.
Hudson wanted him there and Whymper went along with it. So you could say Whymper's ambition and Hudson's ambition allowed a situation which was going to result in an accident. But then if they'd all got down, they'd all have been heroes, and nobody would have thought twice about Haddo's lack of experience.
In Whymper's own account of events, he came up with a new villain. Immediately after the accident, there had been rumors that the rope hadn't snapped in mid-air, but that the old guide, Peter Taugwalder, had cut the rope rather than allow himself and his son to be pulled off when the others slipped. Whymper denied this categorically, but he suggested that Taugwalder might have deliberately put a weak rope between himself and the others, knowing that it would break if anyone below him fell off.
It was the weak rope that had been taken along specifically for making slings to lower off with. And Taugwalder unaccountably had used that rope to link himself to his client, Lord Francis Douglas.
Today, the rope is preserved in the museum in Zermatt.
The thing that really strikes me about this rope is just how incredibly thin it is. I mean, this is just sash cord. It was described as a stout sash cord. It doesn't seem any thicker to me than what we have holding up my windows at home. Assuming that this rope is kept tight between the various people, and so there's no jerk on it if someone slips, it ought to be adequate, just. But as soon as you've got slack in the rope, and someone falling and gathering speed, and then a sudden jerk on the rope, and then bear in mind that this was 4 people, the weight of 4 grown men falling fast and suddenly jerking the rope, I mean, it seems hardly surprising that the thing was just ripped apart.
Taugwalder never accepted that he was at fault. He pointed out that it was Whymper himself who supplied all the ropes, and that by standing firm, he had in fact saved Whymper's life.
He had really bad injuries. He had no skin anymore on the hand on which he had the rope, because they wind it always around in order to better to help. And he had very bad marks. I admire Whymper for certain things, but I must say his character is not a character of an Englishman who are generally very fair, very truthful.
It's the perverse rules of the game at the time. If they were successful, it was a British ascent led by the British party. If something went wrong, it was the fault of the local guides who would bear the responsibility for not having kept their clients safe.
In the end, the debate went beyond the details of this particular tragedy into much bigger questions about mountaineering itself. Nothing like this had ever happened before. All this misery for the sake of climbing a mountain? Could it ever have been worth it?
Queen Victoria wanted to ban climbing, and she instructed her government to ban climbing. And the Prime Minister at the time, Gladstone, went to see her and persuaded that this wasn't a wise course of action.
The Alpine Club was very much put on the spot. The public were saying to them, why do people do this dangerous thing? And there was no real answer to it.
Yes, it is a risk sport, and that's why a lot of people do it, because they enjoy that feeling of overcoming that risk and minimizing it by using technique and knowledge and being aware and reducing that risk. But it won't go to zero. It's a hell of a buzz when you get up it, though.
You can't make the thing totally safe. I mean, if you removed every shred of danger from it, a lot of the sort of frisson of being there would be gone. But to suggest that mountaineers are deliberately seeking danger or have some kind of death wish is simply ludicrous. I mean, there's a sense of living intensely and being intensely alive, which is the complete opposite of having some kind of death wish.
Swiss town. For a brief period, Whymper was the world's most famous mountaineer, and the Matterhorn its most famous mountain. But his was a tainted victory, fame at a price.
Although he picked up and kept on going very well through the rest of his life, it must have always been there, and somebody always asking him about it and so on. When he was doing his lecture tours or whatever, it must have come back to haunt him the entire time. And it was obviously something that people wanted to perhaps talk about or didn't like to talk about or whatever. But yes, it must have been. So rather than, you know, being, oh, marvellous, the first man to climb the Matterhorn, it was the first man to climb the Matterhorn, and the tragedy very much overshadowed it, very much.
Whymper's restless wanderlust took him to Greenland, Canada, and South America. He climbed many more mountains, but the zest had gone. For the rest of his life, he was tormented by nightmares, tortured by the idea that he'd been powerless to help his companions. He grew into a solitary and reclusive old man, bitter and angry at the world. And then, at the age of 66, he got married.
He married, I think, his landlord's daughter. And it was very late in life for him. And it wasn't really talked about within the family. I can't remember off the top of my head how old she was, but she was much younger. And again, that was slightly frowned upon, I think, by the Whymper side of the family. But they were very happy to start off with, I think, together. And, you know, my mother was born, and I'm sure he was thrilled and very, very happy with that. And then the marriage broke down. The family it really wasn't mentioned, because it just wasn't, it was rather frowned upon.
After 4 years, they divorced, and Whymper became even more morose. In 1911, he arrived in Chamonix on his annual tour of the Alps and booked into his favorite hotel in the shadow of Mont Blanc. 2 days later, he fell ill and retired to his room.
He just locked his door and said, "Don't disturb me." And then he died. It was a very strange, solitary death, fitting the man.
I don't know, it's difficult to sort of think what was in his mind at that stage at all. Just wanted to be on his own, cope with it his way.
Today, 3,000 people climb the Matterhorn every year, most of them following Whymper's route. His classic book, Scrambles in the Alps, has inspired many thousands of mountaineers. But its final words are as much a warning as an invitation.
There have been joys too great to be described in words, and there have been griefs upon which I have not dared to dwell. And with these in mind, I say, climb if you will, but remember that courage and strength are naught without prudence, and that a momentary negligence may destroy the happiness of a lifetime. Do nothing in haste, look well to each step, and from the beginning, think what may be the end.